All right, claim number 9. Agape means perfect love.
Okay, so let's do this thing. You'll hear that all the time. And in fact, Benedict XVI did write a encyclical, Caritatis Est, where he talks about the importance of charity. And he uses the Greek words to distinguish the different kinds of ideas. You know, you could say, I love pizza. That means something different than I love my wife. But we also want to be careful about reading too much into that language. So if we look at where is the origin for this, I think a key source is C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves. And what C.S. Lewis does, and here he's a lot less careful than Benedict XVI is, he says, this is our chief aim, the unconditional love of the Father given to us through his Son. And what is that love? It's agape. Agape is this Greek word for love. There's other words, eros, right? There's another word. So if agapao is to love in the perfect sense, phileo is the word that's used for love in just like the sense of friendship. So Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, right? From the word there for friendship, love, and then Delphia, from adelphos, from the Greek word for brother. But this just doesn't hold up. Let's take a look at one of the key passages where this gets bandied about. In John 21, we read, when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love, and the Greek word there is agapao, do you love me more than these? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. I love you. But he uses the different Greek word. Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. Jesus then said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And there's agape language, agapao there again. And Simon says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Phileo is the word that's used there. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. And he said a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Phileo. And Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, do you phileo me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I phileo you. I love you. And people will say, see, Peter's hurt that Jesus didn't say, do you agapao me? He's hurt because Jesus said, do you phileo me? Peter should have agape love for Jesus, but he doesn't. And that's why Peter's hurt. And he's trying to say, no, I don't have enough love for you yet, but I'm working on it. You know that I at least have this kind of love for you. And so he's hurt that Jesus says, do you even phileo me? Oh gosh, yeah, of course at least I phileo you. Okay, this is just not helpful. Okay. First of all, it's not helpful because throughout the passage, Jesus changes the words for other things, like feed my lambs. He uses a different word for feed, different word for lambs, sheep. Is it some great significance in that? No, he's just using different words. So we don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here. Why is Peter grieved? Because he asked him a third time. That's why he's grieved. And if you look at this scene closely in John 21, you'll see that they're by a charcoal fire. There's only one other place in the Gospel of John where we read about a charcoal fire. It's where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. So the reason he's hurt is because it's a recollection of his betrayal. And Jesus is here giving Peter an opportunity to, in a sense, rehabilitate himself, right? We can say a lot more about this. Again, I have an article about this online. You can look it up if you want to really dig down into this. But look at John 16:27. For the Father himself loves phileo you, because you have loved phileo me, and have believed that I came out from God. Wait a minute. The Father doesn't agapao me? He only phileos me? Wow. Should I be hurt that God the Father only has phileo love for us? Of course not. That's absurd, right? So this distinction that agape love is so much greater than phileo love doesn't pay close attention to the Gospel of John. We just don't have this sense where phileo is this lesser kind of love than agapao. Look at John 12. Jesus says, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Well, what kind of love do they have here? Agape love. They agapao the praise of men. So is Jesus saying they have divine love? They have perfect love? Of course not, because they love the praise of men. So you can agape things. You can have agapao love for things that are not great. It's not this perfect word for love. And the passage I really like to highlight for people, I just lost it, is in John 5:20. In John 5:20, we read, for the Father loves phileo, the Son. You would expect that to say, for the Father agapao, right? Has agapao love for the Son. Using just the root word here, because it gets confusing if I start conjugating it. People don't have Greek. But suffice it to say, you don't have the Father agapao loving the Son. He phileo loves. So the shocking fact is, in John, it's actually phileo that is the word that's used for the divine love of the Father, not agape. Agape and phileo don't have these meanings that people ascribe them to or ascribe to them. And you especially see this in the Septuagint, in 2 Samuel or 2 Kingdoms in the Septuagint. We read the story of Amnon, who, of course, rapes Tamar. It happened after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a sister, very beautiful in appearance. Her name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved. And what's the word there? It's the word from agape. Agape, son, is the word that's used there. This is not perfect love. This is not unconditional love. He ends up raping her, and then we read it, and Amnon hated her greatly because the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love after the rape. The hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. But he didn't love her in like an unconditional sense here or anything like that. So this is another misconception. People know a little bit of Greek, just enough Greek to make them dangerous, not helpful.
All right. Claim number 10. Jesus rejected the temple system as oppressive.
Oh, good. Look, I got a picture here. I want to show you. Look at that. That's a book. That's a fantastic book that really deals with this kind of thing. One of the major points of the book is that Jesus does not reject the temple. So one passage that gets brought out a lot to make this point is found in Matthew 12. There are parallel passages in Matthew, but Jesus went to the grain field on the Sabbath, right? And the disciples are hungry and they pick the grain. And then the Pharisees are criticizing him. And then Jesus says, I say to you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. And so people will say, see, this is clear. Jesus does not think God desires sacrifice. God is against sacrifice. That's absurd. This is the kind of expression that you see Paul quote from, for example, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Or, if you want to be my disciple, you have to hate your father and mother, right? You have to hate your own life. Jesus saying you really have to. No, this is a kind of comparison that's used rhetorically. God desires mercy more than sacrifice, is what this means. It doesn't mean God rejects all sacrifice. After all, the sacrifices are instituted by God in the Torah. And it's impossible to imagine that a first century Jew like Jesus would say, oh yeah, God doesn't really want sacrifice. You could just throw away, Leviticus, Numbers. You don't need that, right? In fact, throughout the Gospels, Jesus emphasizes the importance of sacrifice. Look at the Sermon on the Mount. If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled with your brother and then come and offer your gift. Here, Jesus is explaining what the proper etiquette is for offering sacrifice in the temple. He's not saying, oh, don't sacrifice. Sacrifice is bad. Ritual is bad. No, it's nonsense. Another passage we might look at is found in Matthew 8. Jesus heals the leper. And he says to him after he's healed, see that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift, the sacrifice that Moses commanded as a testimony. It could be translated as testimony to them or against them. But here Jesus is commanding. He's not just permitting the leper to offer sacrifice. He's commanding the leper to offer sacrifice in the temple. Maybe my favorite passage, though, to highlight is found in Matthew 23. Jesus says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing." So there are people who think you can swear by the temple, it's not a big deal. Jesus says that is wrong. If anyone swears by the gold in the temple, people will say, he's obligated by his oath. So some people say, it doesn't matter if you swear by the temple, but if you swear by the gold in the temple, then you're obligated by your oath. Jesus says, you're a blind fool. Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold holy? Jesus is saying the temple is what makes the gold holy. Jesus is affirming the sanctity of the temple here. Jesus goes on to say, and you say, if anyone swears by the altar, let's skip this. If anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift upon the altar, he is obligated by his oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift holy? Notice what he says here. The altar is what makes the sacrifice holy. This is affirmed in the book of Exodus. It's affirmed in the Torah. The temple is what makes the sacrifice holy. The altar is what makes the sacrifice holy. Jesus isn't renouncing the holiness of the temple. So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. Here Jesus in Matthew is affirming that God dwells in the temple. It's remarkable. So in the Gospel of Matthew, and all these debates about historical Jesus, and but in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is not rejecting the holiness of the temple. And Matthew's presenting us with a memory of Jesus that very much affirms the holiness of the temple, that very much affirms the importance of the temple. And so to make the claim that somehow Jesus is rejecting the temple or that Jesus is denying the temple's validity, this just doesn't hold up under close scrutiny. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is being very, very clear about the holiness of the temple. Why do people say these things? Again, there are these anti-Semitic tendencies that have been deeply sown in biblical scholarship. Let me just give you a quotation. This is, you know who Julius Wellhausen is, Suan?
I haven't heard of this guy in particular.
You haven't heard of Julius Wellhausen?
Mm-mm.
He is the figure who's most famous for what's known as the documentary hypothesis. So the J source.
I've heard that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So he was most famous in developing that. And what Wellhausen says is this. This is in one of his works. One may regard the non-Jewish in Jesus, the human, as more characteristic than the Jewish. Did you catch that? Whatever is Jewish is not human. Look at that quotation again. You can regard the non-Jewish in Jesus, the human, as more characteristic than the Jewish. What is Jewish is not human. This is a shocking statement that he makes. And if you look at his whole theory of the development of the Pentateuch, what he ends up saying is, well, the priestly source, all the cultic stuff, that just happens at the end. That's the last thing that develops in the Torah. And so his basic approach to Judaism is it goes from this kind of charismatic religion where it's just spontaneously me and God, and then it moves to this ritualistic religion, this kind of medieval Catholicism, right? So this is why people have these kind of deep, pent up, I think, biases against cults and ritual. Pretty sad. So we need to work against that, I think.
And then also like the episode where Jesus cleanses the temple, people think that that's like a sign of him rejecting the temple when that's the exact opposite of what he's doing.
Right, exactly. Let's take a look at that story briefly because you mentioned it, right? Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves." So why is Jesus casting out the merchants in the temple? In the book of Zechariah, we have this important passage. The climax of the book describes the day God regathers his people. There will no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord. So Jesus is just, if you're reading the Gospels on the narrative level here, Jesus has just evoked Zechariah when he enters into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. That's reminiscent of Zechariah 9. There are lots of traces of Zechariah in the Passion narrative in particular. So there's good reason to think that this passage is in the backdrop. But Jesus also quotes two particular passages. So first he does one that's reminiscent of Zechariah 14 to indicate that the Messianic age, the age of redemption, the age of eschatological redemption has arrived. But the second thing he does is he quotes two passages, one from Isaiah, one from Jeremiah. The one from Isaiah reads this way: "For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath," eunuchs, of course, are castrated men, "to the eunuchs keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a name and a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. And I will give them an everlasting name which shall not be cut off." There's a pun there. I'm sorry. It's the Bible. It's not my pun. Okay, so here we see eunuchs who were seen as unfit for the priesthood because they were castrated, now are being given a place of honor in the house of the Lord, in the temple. And the context here is talking about the future day of the restoration of Israel. And it goes on to say, "And foreigners who join themselves to the Lord and to minister him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer." So Isaiah is predicting that in the future day, when God redeems his people, there's going to be a temple. So when Jesus quotes this passage, he quotes the line, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer." The idea is in the future day, when God redeems his people, there will be a temple. So you can't quote the scene of the so-called cleansing of the temple. You can't quote that scene as evidence that Jesus was anti-temple, because in the scene he quotes from a passage of Isaiah that indicates that in the future day there will be an eschatological temple, right? And I would say that the reader of Matthew, who knows the temple destruction is at hand, will recognize that Jesus speaks of the ecclesia in terms of a temple, right? So just as God dwells in the temple, that's why you can't swear by it, God is with those who are united to Christ. Wherever two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. Right? He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. So the community serves as a kind of temple there. So Jesus is an anti-cultic. Now, he does go on to quote Jeremiah, right? "You've made it a den of thieves." Jeremiah is predicting the coming destruction of the temple. And that's what Jesus is doing in that scene. He's predicting the temple is going to be destroyed. In a sense, he's saying there is going to be an eschatological temple, but this one isn't it. Right? That's not because he's against temple worship. It's not because he's against ritual, right? But he is recognizing that because the leadership has rejected him, because especially the aristocrats reject him, judgment is going to come. And so he's not rejecting temple per se, but he is announcing a coming judgment. And these things are mutually, these things are not necessarily antithetical. They are complementary somehow in the Gospel of Matthew. That's a big part of my book.
All right, now to our last four claims. Number 11,
Yeah.
Jews saw God as distant, and Jesus invented the idea that God is close and intimate and loving.
Yeah, let's just get through this really quickly. That's absurd. The idea that God is close and intimate and compassionate to his people, that God is Father, is found in the prophets, in the Jewish scriptures. So Hosea 11, "It was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them." And you also have Psalms where the psalmist is going to cry out to God and address God as Father. See this in Psalm 89. He shall cry to me, you are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. There is a book I should mention here somehow. Oh, here it is. This is the Jewish Annotated New Testament. And there's a fantastic essay in the back of this by Amy Jill Levine on bearing false witness. And it deals with a lot of these kind of anti-Semitic readings that have crept in. This idea that, oh, well, Jews believe that God was distant. You could only access him through a complicated ritual system where priests stood in the way between you and God. Right? And Jesus, he came to say, let's chuck all that. Jesus is the proto-Protestant reformer. You don't need ritual. Just approach God as your loving Father and have a personal relationship with him. This is just not true. And you see in rabbinic sources, for example, Honi the circle drawer and other rabbinic figures, they have prayers that also speak to God in an intimate way, where they also call him Father. So we need to be aware that, yes, Jesus teaches us that God is Father. And yes, there's a way that Jesus transcends even Jewish hopes. He's the divine Son. And he has intimacy with the Father like no other human son of God can have, according to the New Testament. But we don't need to denigrate Judaism to exalt Jesus.
Right. Claim number 12.
Yeah.
All Jews wanted a military Messiah, and so Jesus was rejected because he taught that one should love one's enemies. Dr. Barber, take it away.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. First of all, the commandment to love your neighbor, that's from the book of Leviticus. The idea that Jews thought that you should just crush all your enemies. Some did. Some had different perspectives on, for example, what would happen with the Gentiles. We certainly know that all Jews did not have the same messianic hopes. We see evidence against that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, and a document known as 1Q Rule of the Community. We read, until the prophet comes and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. And here it seems to describe the coming of two messiahs. And people look back at the book of Zechariah and they can see evidence that there was an understanding that both the high priest and the royal figure were anointed ones. And so there are texts that seem to point to the idea of not just a royal Messiah, but also a priestly Messiah. And then there are different ideas of what that eschatological deliverer is going to do. And so this idea of they just persecuted Jesus because he was about love. And what Jews really wanted was just to kill all their enemies. They may have been some Jews that thought that way, but we got to be really careful about painting with a broad brush there.
So it's a simplistic view of Second Temple views of the Messiah.
Totally. Yep.
All right.
Yep. Yeah, let's just move to the next one then.
All right, next claim.
Yeah.
The Johannine chronology of the Passion Week has Jesus die before the Passover.
Yeah, that one doesn't really hold up when you look at it closely. This is kind of an old chestnut in biblical scholarship, and people for a long time look at the Gospel of John and they say, oh, well, it looks like the timeline is different in the Passion narrative than in the Synoptics. There's a great book on this written by my friend Brand Petrie, Jesus in the Last Supper. I highly recommend this book. I think it's a game changer. What Petrie shows is that people have thought that the Johannine narrative of the Passion in John, is different from the narrative in the Synoptic Gospels because they're misreading phrases in the Gospel of John and technical terms in the Gospel of John without understanding how they would have been heard in the first century. So I'll give you a couple of things. In John 18, we read this. Of course, we read this every Holy Week. And a lot of people don't even notice that there's an apparent contradiction with the Synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now we read, then they led Jesus after he was arrested from Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. All right, so people point out, well, notice here they haven't eaten the Passover meal yet. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Passover takes place during the Last Supper. So people will say, well, here we have an obvious contradiction that in John's gospel, the Passover meal hasn't happened yet. So the Last Supper in the Gospel of John is understood to be a kind of preemptive Passover meal, an anticipatory Passover meal. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're offering the simple sacrifices. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it must be the case that we have a different chronology. I just don't think this holds up under close scrutiny, as I'll explain in a second. Another issue is in John 19, we read, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat on the judgment seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. That must mean they're preparing for the Passover. So you see, once again, we have a passage in John that seems to indicate that the Passover hasn't happened yet. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' Last Supper is the Passover meal, so they're not following the same chronology. One more. Well, I guess I'll end it there. Let me just, we could say so much about these. This is a whole episode unto itself, and of course, Petrie's written a massive book on this. I've also written an article on this. So we say a lot about it, but let me just highlight Luke 22:1 to begin with. In Luke 22:1, we see something very interesting that's often overlooked. Now, the feast of unleavened bread, which is called Passover, was at hand. Notice here, the entire feast is called Passover. The feast of unleavened bread is a week long. The word Pascha could mean lots of different things. One thing that it could mean is the meal itself that you would celebrate at the beginning of that week, Passover meal, right? But that's not the only thing that it could refer to. Pascha could also refer to the entire week of unleavened bread, right? And when you understand that, then you realize that a lot of these passages in John don't necessarily represent any kind of different chronology, because all of the meals during the Feast of Unleavened Bread would have been called Passover, right? And so when they can't go into the praetorium because they want to eat the Passover, it's not necessarily describing a different chronology. It can just be read as describing one of the meals during that week of Pascha, right? Now, the other one that gets brought up a lot, and I mentioned earlier, is the line about the day of preparation. And you see that it's the day of preparation of the Passover, so therefore Passover hasn't happened yet. But as Petrie shows, this again overlooks the rabbinic evidence, the Jewish way of speaking. The day of preparation is the day of preparation for Sabbath. It's actually a technical term, right? Day of preparation is the day for Friday. You see this in the Synoptic Gospels very clearly. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, it was the day of preparation and the Sabbath grew near. What is that? It's Friday, right? So when John says that it was the day of preparation of the Passover, he's not saying it's the day to prepare for the big Passover meal. What he's saying is it was Friday of the Passover week. And that Sabbath day during that Passover week would have been an especially important Sabbath day, right? So again, it's not talking, so it's the day of preparation. It's the Friday of the Passover week. That's what's going on here, right? It's not necessarily giving you a different timeline than what you find in the Synoptics. And just to highlight one other thing, in the book of Deuteronomy, you see that Passover involves not just the meal that starts the week, but a lot more. So for example, we read in Deuteronomy, you offer the Passover sacrifice in the evening at sunset, the time of day when you departed from Egypt. You shall cook it and eat it at the place that the Lord your God will choose. The next morning you may go back to your tents. For 6 days you shall continue to eat unleavened bread. And on the seventh day, there shall be a solemn assembly of the Lord. So you do this, you eat it. What do? You eat the Passover, and you do this, you continue to eat it for 6 days. Your feast. It's not just one day in Jewish sources. So this makes a lot of sense then of what's going on, I think, in the Gospel of John. Brandt will often in lectures appeal to Easter. You could say Happy Easter, and that can refer to Sunday, but Happy Easter can be said on Easter Monday, can be said on Easter Tuesday, right? Same thing with Christmas. when I say Merry Christmas, I don't just mean Christmas Day, right? There's a Christmas season, especially if you're a Catholic, you know, it's not just the one day of December 25th, right? And so people who don't come, I'd say, from a Catholic perspective or a perspective with a liturgical calendar don't usually understand how liturgical calendars work. And so when they see John use phrases like, oh, they couldn't go into the Praetorium because they wouldn't eat the Passover, they limit it to that one day. And then I think it skews their understanding of what that whole sequence is describing in John's narrative. Anyway, we say a lot more, but that sums it up. If you want to get into the details, into the weeds on this, definitely check out Petrie's book, Jesus and the Last Supper.
What surprises me about that misconception is that this isn't something that you hear from, like some of these you might hear from fundamentalist Christians, but this one is among scholars, you know, even of the highest ranks who are saying things like this to try and show a tension in the Gospels.
Right. This is standard. So the standard textbook that's used for Introduction to the New Testament courses in universities is Bart Ehrman's textbook. And he uses this as an example of how the Synoptics and John give us different perspectives on the life of Jesus, which they do. That's fair. But people have read these things, I think, in a way that overreads them. Just as, you know, there might be conservatives or fundamentalists who will read too much into text because they really want it to be harmonized. And at the same time, and I'm not saying that all the text in the New Testament can be harmonized. I'm not trying to say that either. But there are people who are so eager to show all the discontinuities that they don't consider there are other ways to read some of these passages.
Right.
And I think it creates problems.
All right, here is the last claim that we're going to address in this episode.
Right.
There was no lamb at the Last Supper. Jesus was the only Lamb of God at this meal.
Yes. So this gets said all the time, and it's also popular among those who want to claim Jesus was in the scene. One of the supposed solutions to the chronology problem, right? That Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus eat the Last Supper on Passover, but in John, it's not Passover yet. It is Passover is a whole week. But people will say, well, one of the solutions to that is Jesus followed a different calendar than the high priests. And they'll say, well, Jesus celebrated a Passover meal without a lamb. You'll see this even in Catholic theologians who I think, you know, should know better, but they're trying to make an important theological point. That is that Jesus is the Lamb of God. John makes that point, right? But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lamb at the Last Supper as well. We see very clear evidence that there was a lamb at the Last Supper, especially in Mark's gospel. So in Mark 14, this is what we read. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover, now what does it refer to there? What does a Passover mean? The Greek word is Pascha. And as I just explained, Pascha can mean lots of things. It can refer to that one meal, right, that kicks off the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but it could also refer to the lamb itself. That's what's going on here. When they sacrificed the Pascha, right, the Pascha here refers to the lamb. So when they sacrificed the Paschal lamb, Jesus' disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Pascha? And what it means here is the lamb, right? Because that's what it just meant in the previous verse, right? You sacrifice not the meal, you sacrifice not the feast day, you sacrifice that 7 days, you sacrifice the lamb. So Pascha can also refer to the lamb. So they say, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Pascha? Jesus is going to eat the Paschal lamb. Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you, follow him, and wherever he enters, you should say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Pascha? This is not a reference to just eating the Passover meal in terms of like just generally celebrating the Passover. It's a reference to eating the Paschal lamb that was sacrificed, right? Here, it goes on to say, he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Prepare for us there. So the disciples left and went into the city, and they found it as he had said to them, and they prepared the Pascha. What do they mean they prepared the Pascha? It doesn't mean they prepared the room, because we just saw the room is already prepared. Doesn't mean that they prepared the herbs or no, it's not preparing the meal. It's broadly, they prepared the Paschal lamb because there are very specific regulations as to how the lamb had to be sacrificed, how it had to be roasted. That's what's going on here in Mark's gospel. So Mark's gospel makes it very clear that they were sacrificing the Passover lamb at Jesus's direction, and they ate a Passover meal consisting of a Passover lamb.
Well, Dr. Barber, you've knocked it out of the park. I enjoyed all of this. It's so much fun.
Good. It was fun for me.
I mean, we have so many others to still cover, but we'll do this in a second part. How about that?
We'll have to do it at another time. Yeah, we have a lot to. There's so many, right? Bible's a big book.
Is there anything you want to say before we end the episode, Dr. Barber?
I would just say two things. The first thing I'd say is for those of us who are believers, those of us who come to the Bible with a perspective of faith, it's important for us to try to read the Bible carefully, because one of the slanders that people will use is that, well, if you come to the Bible from a theological perspective, that just means you're going to play fast and loose with texts. You're just going to read all your own theology into texts. And when we don't read the Bible carefully, and we say things about it that are not anchored in the text itself and actually contradict the text itself, we lend credibility to the approach that a theological reading of scripture is somehow not carefully exegetical. So it really goes to the question of the credibility of the faith of a theological perspective for all of us to read the Bible carefully. The second thing I'd just say is, for anybody who's interested in learning more about this kind of thing, I want to encourage you to check out the Augustine Institute. We have a graduate program. You can take courses online. We have about 500 students here in the program. And if you're one of those people who just loves this kind of stuff, and I mentioned these books and you're buying them on Amazon, and you really want to, you want to really pursue these things, and you're a young college student with thoughts about maybe going on to do an academic degree, I want to encourage you to check out the Masters in Biblical Studies program we have here at the Augustine Institute. We accept about 3-4 students a year to that program. Students often receive scholarship to that program. They even can get a stipend in some cases, so you don't have to work. All right, so you get a paycheck while you're a student. So that's sometimes available to students. This is for people who want to learn languages, want to work hard in Greek and Hebrew, who aren't at all phased by reading 400 pages a week for a class or something like that. So if that's you, if you're a student who really wants to do this in an academic way, I want to encourage you to apply to that. We have all the directions. You'd have to take the GRE exam, and you'd have to have pretty high GPA scores. But really encourage you to check that out. This is an exciting program. So thanks so much, Suan. This was a lot of fun.
Of course. And I'd encourage my audience to check out Dr. Barber's books.
Thank you.
You have books ranging from, top tier academic books to also really high quality popular books. And so there's an audience for everybody.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I have the book on the historical Jesus, which is from Cambridge University Press. And that's for people who are really interested in these kind of more technical questions. And then if you just want to enter into the Christmas season and you want to read the text in a way that's informed by the scriptures, or if you want to enter into the season in a way that's informed by the scriptures and come to a deeper appreciation for these stories, I do have that book, The True Meaning of Christmas. And the last 2 chapters are my favorite 2 chapters, maybe. The second to last chapter, I look at how did December 25th become Christmas? And that involved a lot of research. It was a lot of fun. And then the last chapter is like, how did we get Christmas trees and get from St. Nicholas to Santa Claus? And there's a lot of myth out there, and I try to set the record straight on some of those things. So yeah, St. Nicholas didn't punch Arius out at the Council of Nicaea, and I don't know why Catholics want to spread this meme about that, but who was St. Nicholas, and why did we end up with Santa Claus, and why was it Catholics that actually came up with the idea that you give gifts to children under the name of St. Nicholas? Well, it was sisters, religious sisters, who came up with that idea. Yeah, you might check out the book.